and welcome. Oh, good. The recording is in progress. My name is Tom Kaplanis, and on behalf of the Albanian-American Bar Association, I'm happy to welcome you here for tonight's discussion with our esteemed guest, Lea Ypi, about her critically acclaimed book, Free, A Child in a Country at the End of History. As many of you know, the Albanian-American Bar Association's mission is to not only promote the practice of law and support the next generation of Albanian-American legal professionals, but also, as we are doing here, to encourage civic engagement amongst us all. I'd like to introduce my co-panelists who will help to facilitate this conversation. Christy Panduku is a co-president of the AABA and an attorney and partner at Eckert Siemens, where he focuses his practice on corporate and M&A matters. We'd like to take this opportunity to thank Eckert Siemens for supporting the AABA's charitable causes and sponsoring our event today. Adele Jaspers is also co-president of the AABA and an attorney at the Massachusetts Executive Office of Health and Human Services. Members of the audience, tonight we welcome your questions, so please do submit them by typing on the Zoom Q&A feature. I will be monitoring that throughout the event, and we will reserve time at the end of the presentation to get some of your questions. Professor Lea Ypi teaches political theory at the London School of Economics and Political Science and is an honorary professor in philosophy at the Australian National University. A native of Albania, she has degrees in philosophy and literature from the University of Rome La Sapienza, a PhD from the European University Institute, and was a postdoctoral prize research fellow at Newfield College, Oxford University. She is an established author, and it is her latest book, a philosophical memoir, that brings us together tonight. Free, A Child in a Country at the End of History won Lea the 2022 Royal Society of Literature Prize and was named a Best Book of the Year by a dozen journalistic organizations from around the world, including The New Yorker, Washington Post, Financial Times, and Sunday Times. The book has been translated into more than 25 languages, and I encourage all of you to pick one and read it. Welcome, Lea. We are excited to be able to have a conversation with you tonight. Thank you for being here. So without any further ado, Adele and Christy, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Judge Kaplanis. Lea, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us here tonight. Free is a wonderfully written book, which is now available on paperback in the US. And as Judge Kaplanis said, we encourage all to get the book and read it, as it is truly a must read. Here at the AABA, we have very much looked forward to having this conversation with you, Lea. There is so much to unpack in this book, as you have touched on various key aspects of life over 2 decades of a difficult period in Albania's modern history. It makes the most sense then to start at the beginning. The title, its Hegelian meaning, echoes, the 2-part structure of the book, and as importantly, what does it mean to be free? Is freedom the capacity of people to choose one's ends and respect others to do the same? Or is there a broader meaning to freedom, such as sharing in self-government or deliberating with fellow citizens about the meaning of a good and flourishing life?
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here and also for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and I'm only sorry that I'm not there in person. So I'll start by saying something about the title and then maybe try and unpack a little bit this concept of freedom. The title is in English, in the sort of British English, it's Coming of Age at the End of History. And in the American version, it's A Child in a Country at the End of History. But the concept of the end of history is important in both editions. And in fact, I've tried to retain it in all the different translations of the book. And it's an ironic title, just like Free is also an ironic title. I think one of the things that the book tries to show is how freedom is sometimes presented to us as an ideal, sometimes as a promise, often historically appears as an illusion, sometimes a disillusion. And what the book tries to do is to create a conversation between different characters, each of which tries to convey a particular understanding of what freedom is in particular social and political circumstances. The End of History bit is an ironic title, and it's a nod to Francis Fukuyama's theory of the end of history with the end of the Cold War. You will be familiar with the thesis that once the Cold War was over, the ideological clashes between the East and West were over with a clear winner. And it was somehow, Fukuyama thought, pointless to continue this conversation. There was simply no ideological alternative to liberalism. And one of the most interesting things for those who have read Fukuyama is at some point there is a little paragraph in which he says, of course, there will be countries or specific historical context there where this will not be the case. And if we really want to know about the end of history, we don't ask Albanians. So this is what Fukuyama says. And so my title was an ironic title because it was an Albanian take on the end of history, even though it's a story set in Albania. It is about Albania. It's told by an Albanian, and there's many Albanian elements that frame the book. But I hope some of the things that I try to convey about freedom resonate throughout the post-communist world, in particular, the tension between the concept of freedom promoted throughout communism, sometimes honestly and sometimes disingenuously, sometimes with complicity and sometimes with coercion, and the concept of freedom that many of these post-transition societies encountered in the post-1990 period, again, with its both promise and illusion aspect. Now, when I'm asked, how do I define freedom? I think one of the worst things that you could do to freedom is to actually frame it for a public and to try and persuade people, because one of the points and one of the takeaways, I think, of the book, and one of the ambitions in writing it in the way in which I wrote it, was to try and take the readers on a journey and to open questions more than answer them for them. In part of my transition from academic writing to literary writing in the way in which it appears in Free was really to try and have different characters, each of which had a different perspective on freedom, but without really resolving the dispute between them, and to try and actually let the reader draw the conclusions. Now, there's only one point in the book in which I kind of break that pact with the reader, but I almost make it clear that I've broken the pact by calling that part of the book the epilogue. So the story in a way is over, and up to the point where the epilogue starts, you don't really know what the author thinks about freedom. You don't really know what they believe, which of these different conceptions of freedom that the book conveys. The author also is committed to, in part because, as I say, for me, the most important message of these two parts of the book was the idea of presenting the tensions of how, freedom was understood by citizens, by normal people, by state officials, by people who had been in prison. So there's a variety of characters, and each of them kind of tries to convey these different meanings of freedom. In the epilogue, I say that for me, the concept of freedom that I kind of personally side with is the one that also appears throughout the book through the character of my grandmother. And her idea of freedom is one that connects freedom to the conception of moral agency. So you are only free insofar as you retain the capacity to be a moral agent. And you are a moral agent regardless of what the world tells you about that, the limits of that capacity, and regardless of the compromises and regardless of the efforts of everyone to thwart that freedom. And that is the case in both contexts, both in the socialist context and in the post-socialist context. And for me, the most important thing is that moral conception of freedom, because it seems to me that once you have that conception of freedom, then you have a critical standpoint from which you can assess all the societies in which you live and all the circumstances in which you live. And that gives you a kind of moral compass to then begin a critique, which then needs to be expanded and move from being a kind of individual critique to being a more social critique. Now, there is also, in my own personal conception of freedom, there are also more empirical components to it. And I know that's the most controversial part of the book, and certainly been the most controversial part of the book in Albania. But it's not really what drives the book forward. What is really important to me, and what's important to me that readers understand, is that for me, freedom is not and cannot be defined by an authority, including the authority of an author like me, and that it would be wrong to try and convince people that this is the right thing for you, or this is freedom, and you should believe this conception of freedom, because I think that's actually where a lot of historical mistakes have come from exactly that effort to try and kind of define it for people. And what stands out is this, as I say, association of freedom with moral agency, which then people need to understand and engage with and apply in historical circumstances and educate themselves about. And once they do that, they will come up with social criticism that need to be confronted with others. And then there is a whole process. And as I say, a whole journey that begins and takes readers forward.
Thank you for that, Lea. And thank you again for joining us and for writing this book. This book vividly captures a lot of my experiences as a child, being born in Albania in the 80s, growing up in the volatile transition period to democracy, and leaving the country in March '97 in the midst of the country's civil war. Many of the anecdotes that you describe in this book relate directly to my experiences growing up in Albania. Things like your family dynamics, like your family fights over getting property back, which we're still going through 30 years later in my family, or your description of the events in '97, which brought back vivid memories for me, including a period where I, like you, lost the ability to speak for some time after witnessing firsthand violent skirmishes following the '96 elections on my walk home from school. On a happier note, another similarity is your relationship to your grandmother, which you alluded to, which is obviously very important to you, and she's a very important character in this book. I had a similar relationship with my grandmother growing up, who kind of raised me like your grandmother raised you. In spite of the many adversities and misfortunes throughout your grandmother's life, she maintained that she was the author of her own life and was in control of her own fate. And you mentioned that she looked at freedom through the lens of morality. But an interesting quote she had in the book was that freedom is being conscious of necessity. Can you discuss what she meant by this quote? And looking at her experience, was it possible for an individual to maintain any sort of freedom or agency over their lives in that political system?
Sorry, I'm just making note of the questions.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a quote that I'm not sure if she really ever conveyed it in that exact way, but I think she conveyed it with her way of being and with her more overarching kind of life lessons. And that's certainly what I took away from her and what I then sort of put together with other philosophical readings that I did. I think a lot of it and a lot of that conception of freedom hangs on just recognizing the limitations of the world around us. So we're always born in a particular place. We're always born at a particular time. We're always at the mercy of circumstances. And there is a much wider philosophical debate around this, the fact that you have all these constraints, does that make you a determined person? Which is exactly what you were also hinting at and of course, in sort of totalitarian circumstances or in oppressive societies, that question becomes much more urgent and much more important. And the stakes of answering it also become much higher. But I think the idea of the consciousness of necessity is in a way, as I say, conducive to this kind of larger philosophical debate around, well, the fact that we're always born in a particular time of place, that every single decision that we're thrown into comes from somewhere, is conditioned by other decisions that we have no impact on, is a big challenge in a way to saying, well, I'm the author of my life, because none of us actually really is the author of their life. You were always thrown somewhere, we were always brought somewhere. In my case, most of my decisions came out from funding applications. And so I can't really say that I made any of those really autonomously, insofar as I was trying to, just survive. And I think what most of us do is that. Now, of course, my grandmother, in her life and in her case, this was extreme also because of the extremes that she had to go through. So she was born in a very different historical era. She came to Albania hoping to find an identity and investing in this new state that was emerging in the Balkans in the 1920s and 30s and thinking that they would kind of construct that state. Those efforts were completely destroyed as well because of the way in which historical forces were balancing each other. And so in a way, her entire life was a constant challenge to the idea that we are free or that we have this kind of moral capacity, because every time she tried to do the right thing, she was conditioned by circumstances but in a way, for me, that life story is really important, and it's actually at the center of my next book. It's really important because it shows you that you don't do things because you're hoping to be rewarded or because you're hoping that it will go well for you, or because you're expecting anyone to actually to say, how great that whole thing was. So you have to do the right thing just because it's the right thing to do. And in that, asserting your will, regardless of the constraints, that is freedom. It's the fact that you can still do that, even if it won't go well for you. You will end up in prison and so on. Now, of course, it's heroic, and most people may not be able to do that. But there are examples in history of people who do. And I think what we need to know from our point of view when we think about that conception of freedom is just the possibility. We don't really need to have certainty that that conception of freedom leads you anywhere. We just need to have an example of heroes or people who have kind of succeeded regardless of these constraints in maintaining their moral integrity, even if their moral integrity didn't lead anywhere. They didn't get anything out of it. They weren't promoted. They weren't recognized. They were, nobody actually even said thank you to them for upholding that kind of integrity. And they just did it just because they had to do it. And I think that's what, in a way, that story tells me, or that's what I kind of took away from it. That's exactly what real freedom is of. It's the consciousness of necessity, in that you know that you're always constrained, but you still, regardless of the fact that you're constrained, you also know that you can resist these constraints when it comes to what does your moral duty tell you to do.
Thank you.
Lea, in the book, you speak to two juxtaposing phenomena that existed in Albanian communist society. On the one hand, solidarity, and on the other, suspicion and doubt. Regarding solidarity, you write in your book, and I'm quoting, "We relied on friends and neighbors for everything. Whenever the need arose, we simply knocked on their door regardless of the time of day. If they did not have what we were looking for, or if they could not help with whatever we needed, they offered substitutions or recommended another family who might be able to help." Throughout your book, there are also examples of suspicion and doubt, especially those centered around betrayal or perceived betrayal of the values of the Socialist Party. Can you speak a little bit to the dichotomy between solidarity on the one hand and suspicion on the other, and how their coexistence could be reconciled?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most interesting aspects of Albanian society, actually, and it's one of these very many contradictions that I think one finds when looking at Albanian politics and Albanian history and just kind of Albanian ethos more generally, I think. I think the solidarity aspect has two features to it. One is the fact that this is a kind of post-Ottoman, but not quite liberal society. And so it's a society in which community and kinship has always played a really important role historically and anthropologically. And that gets carried over throughout, because I think just Albanian communism builds on those features. It doesn't completely overcome them. So community has always been important. It's a society that's always grounded on tradition, that's always grounded on kind of who you know and who your relatives with, where family is also really important. So there are a number of values that are, let's call them communitarian values, that remain there, coupled with the fact that because it's not a society that becomes commodified and commercialized, solidarity can't be a service that can kind of get bought and sold. So if Albania had become a market society like it has become now, perhaps some of these older, let's call them pre-modern or kind of pre-capitalist features might have disintegrated because of the availability of just a different relation between people that is a commercial relation. So now in Albania, you don't have to rely on your neighbors to look after your child anymore. You usually, if you're lucky, you can kind of pay a babysitter, or you purchase a service. So a number of these services weren't available during communism. And I think what society did was just kind of carrying over those features that it had inherited from previous historical periods. And they survived in communist Albania, in part also because they enabled people to cope with the hardships. So you have a scarcity, or you need something, and you have a very dense network of social and family relations, and you rely on that dense network to just cope with difficulties. So it seems to me it's a kind of natural survival mechanism. What's really interesting for me is how that went hand in hand with the extensive presence of a surveillance state as well. And so this was also a society where you had to be very careful about what you said, and about what who you talked to and what you talked about, and the fact that there could be spies everywhere, that your life could change from one day to the other. So you were at the complete mercy of these surveillance forces. And I think that's the way in which that was navigated, was simply by developing a kind of individual capacity to make these decisions about who you can trust and who you can't trust, as my family did, but as I'm sure a lot of families did. So you just develop a kind of internal mechanism of finding out who your friends are and who your neighbors are. And sometimes those friends and enemies were usually not really necessarily overlapping with political allegiances. And that's something, again, I think that's very important, and that's forgotten in post-communist Albania, that sometimes the people you trusted weren't necessarily the people in your family. Sometimes in kind of former persecuted families, the people you suspected most were actually members of your family who you were worried that they might have converted into spies or whatever during communism. And there were so-called honest communists, or at least that's how my family used to call them, who you could actually turn to for, you know, helping out if you needed to process application, something in school, or if you needed help with your job and so on. So these networks weren't necessarily, I think, divided between political lines. And I think that's what they enabled people to, in some ways, also survive. But it's also what makes it now very, very complicated. The process of kind of settling accounts with history is exactly the fact that there was this distribution of solidarity.
Thank you.
Kind of in that vein, there are a lot of moving anecdotes in this book. And one of my favorites is your humorous but painful story about Bashkim Spahiu, a neighbor who didn't have socks to wear one day, but had a chauffeur and a Mercedes the next. So he went from being a loyal party member to a successful Democratic politician overnight. That resonated with me because I remember adults around me in the 90s sharing similar stories about countless people. The idea that the party insiders of yesterday were now the clairvoyant leaders of the capitalist future must have had a big impact on society's confidence in their government and the direction of society itself. Was there any way for Albania to avoid these conflicts in the transition that led to the turmoil of the early 90s through 97? Or was this struggle always going to be inevitable for the country? Could the international community have done more to help the country in this period of transition? And what could they have done?
Thank you. Was it possible to avoid this transition? In Albania, especially, I think very unlikely, very hard, because the transition was actually guided by the party. So historically, there wasn't a dissident movement in Albania in the way in which there was Solidarność in Poland, or there was Havel in the Czech Republic that had been alive throughout the 1970s and 80s. I think Albania was very top down and very hierarchical, and there was a high degree of censorship and oppression. That meant that when things were ready to change, it wasn't because anyone was particularly brave, and kind of course there was bravery as well, but I think there was a bravery that was coupled with a decision made from the top to let this transition happen in a way. And so that meant that the people who conducted the transition were the people who were also complicit with the system. And the cost was either, if you don't have a strong dissident movement, if you don't have strong bottom-up pressure from society, who is going to conduct the change? So either it's not going to happen at all, in which case Albania would have remained communist, or it would have been the people from the top who it would have been really unlikely at that point to start the process of kind of settling accounts with the past right away, and to clean and do all the historical injustice, to have all the historical injustice conversations that we now have in Albania. So I think that my answer to the first part of the question, was it possible to have it differently? I doubt it. I mean, I could be wrong, and maybe one should have more of a historian's sort of detailed account of what happened and how it happened. But just from my perception and recording of events, it seems very, very unlikely. And if I can speak just from my family's perspective, who was a formerly persecuted family, I don't think my parents were on the front line trying to fight for a new system, because they had already done that in the 1940s and 50s, and they knew what happened when they did it. So they had that memory of that having been already tried and failed was very present in them, and so that made it very difficult. The international community, I think there's two aspects to that question, to that answer. Politically, they might have done something, but I don't know if it would have been good for Albania if they had done it, because at that, I'm suspicious and I'm doubtful that any transition that is guided from above is actually really effective. So if people don't have a stake in the change that they require, I doubt that the change can be lasting, or that they can have actually investment in it, or they have agency in the way in which events unfold. And so, I mean, of course, the international community helped, and a lot, and still does, and still has a very important presence in Albania. But I'm suspicious of their presence always, because the stronger their presence is, the less likely people are to become proper democratic agents. So they really become democratic agents once they know it really is in their hands. And the less it's in their hands, the more likely they are to just depend from others and look outside for options. What they could have done more generally, I think, again, and that's a very good question of whether that could have been avoided at an international level. one of the problems with the transition in Eastern Europe more generally was this illusion or this idea that political transition from state communism required also neoliberal reform and opening up to free markets and kind of privatizing and completely dismantling the state sector and dismantling the elementary forms of solidarity that you had in society. I have a feeling that a more cautious approach to the economy and to what was called the shock therapy back then, and to the way in which economic reforms were conducted, would have been probably more prudent in the long term and would have caused less of the disaster socially that Albanians were, but not just Albanians, everyone actually in Eastern Europe were hit with in the early 90s, and to some extent continues right now.
Yeah, going back to the conception of freedom and the notion of freedoms that we talked about at the beginning, one of the freedoms that Albanians realized after the fall of communism was the freedom of movement to leave the country after being an open-air prison for over four decades. However, Albanians had a taste of the irony and sad reality that while they had the freedom of movement to leave the country, they didn't have the freedom to enter other countries for the most part. You vividly describe in your book how the international narrative about Albanians changed overnight, from Albanians being the victims of a totalitarian regime and political refugees fleeing prosecution, 1 minute to the next minute being painted as perpetrators of crimes, or economic migrants that were a drain on Western societies. This issue remains prevalent today, nearly 30 years later, with the current political scapegoating of Albanians in the UK, which you have been outspoken. How do you think the West should have approached this issue then and now?
Just writing the question down. I think one of the things that I try to do in those paragraphs of the book is to actually exactly present those remainders of freedom. And so to talk about, and freedom of movement is a very good test case for how seriously do we mean freedom when we talk about it. And to also expose the kind of hypocrisy that surrounds freedom discourse when you say to someone, now you're free, but then actually, I could be free now to leave this room, but if all the doors around me are closed, then how free am I to actually leave the room? So it was one of the cases where I thought it was very vivid the way you could render this asymmetry, but to some extent also the kind of moral hypocrisy that surrounds freedom, where the discourse in the communist period was all around how communist countries were locking their citizens in, they were killing the people at the border, they weren't letting them out. And then the minute Eastern countries let their citizens out, that very moment coincided with a moment where Western countries would actually keep them out and shut their borders to entering immigrants. And, there's a lot of kind of a long philosophical debate around, is killing the same as letting die? And allegedly, the idea is that it's not the same because the type of moral harm is worse and so on. But as I see it, one of the problems with the way in which contemporary migration discourse is conducted is exactly that once the narrative of regime change, of an alternative to the system, was no longer available in Western countries, and people were no longer a threat, and other societies were no longer a threat because they didn't present a kind of alternative developmental model, then the migrants became the scapegoats for all the problems that couldn't be, that needed to be outsourced somehow, that people, all these liberal, advanced capitalist societies all began to encounter their problems. Their problems were not solved with the end of communism. The only difference was that now there was no systemic alternative available anymore. So in a way, in that sense, Fukuyama was right that ideologically liberalism was the only game in town. And when that became clear, then in order to justify the failures of this model, you began to individualize the responsibilities. And how do you individualize the responsibility? Well, by blaming the other. So by blaming the immigrant, by blaming the people who are threatening you for jobs and so on. And I think Albanians in that sense, as I say, they don't stand out from other communities. They are just the victims of this project, which is one that fails to place migration in its proper place in the political and moral discourse overall, and fails to raise this question of freedom that all these societies are in principle committed to, but in practice very far from enabling and very far from realizing. Can that be done differently, and can that be handled differently? I think it can, but it requires, first of all, a change in discourse and how we talk about migration. So the fact that we talk about migration as a problem with the movement of people, why do these people come here? What do Albanians want? Why do they leave their societies? unless we raise the larger problem of the developmental framework within which migration becomes a problem, then we won't be able to see the larger pattern. And so we won't be able to understand that actually migration is not really a problem of movement of people, it's a problem of justice, and more specifically of international justice. It's a problem of distribution of opportunities between areas of the world and of areas of Europe, and of unequal patterns of development and different histories and so on. So it becomes a much more complicated question that requires changing things, not just in countries like Albania, but just changing the model through which we all interact with each other, globally speaking. And that's, of course, much more demanding and harder because many more interests are at stake, and many more people are interested in preserving the status quo. And it's a lot easier to just kind of campaign and win votes by blaming immigrants for taking your jobs than to say, look, there's a problem with the system here, and we all need to work through a systemic change.
Thank you.
On that migration issue, the outward migration and brain drain has been very damaging to Albania, and you could argue it's actually been a boon to the Western societies. Can Albanian society recover from this ongoing drain of talent? And is there anything that it can do to stem the tide of immigration, in the near future?
I think it can. I don't think it's impossible, but I think it requires taking on the particular way in which political and economic interests have been entrenched in those areas of the world, not just Albania, but the Balkans more generally and Eastern Europe more generally. The way they have been entrenched in the last 30 years is what's basically becoming an obstacle to social justice and social progress. So I think to keep people inside, there's several aspects there, but to me, there's a political and economic discourse. So you need to have opportunities for development and equal opportunities for development, not just in the capital, but between like the capital and rural areas, and also between different parts of the citizenry. So you need to make sure that people believe that, it's possible to have the life that they would get somewhere else, also not necessarily by exposing themselves to the danger of leaving their country. So I think it requires changing the model of development, but that model of development can't be changed for nothing. There's a cost to it. And I worry that Albania and many other Balkan countries are too far on the road of just having certain very strong economic interests who capture the state, and who, in order to be able to then have the state reappropriate power and reappropriate resources, the state needs to be much more aggressive vis-a-vis these economic actors. Now, I don't really see this discourse in the Balkans. I don't see it in Albania at all. In Albania, it's always about X-politician was corrupt or Y politician stole money from the state and so on. But there's very little discourse around the fact that you need an effective, for example, taxation system in order to have hospitals and schools and to have public opportunities. And these things don't come, they're not manna from heaven, The resources need to come from somewhere. Where are they going to come from? Well, they're going to come from the people who have too much. And so I think there's an inequality in society that can only be redressed if the model of development that we're in is fundamentally challenged and revisited. But I don't really see that happening. The second aspect of it is that I think Albanians have very little hope in themselves as a society, and very little faith actually in their agency. And it's, again, when I said earlier that it's a kind of society full of paradoxes, to me, this is one of the greatest paradoxes about Albanian people, is that on the one hand, they are very confident individually, but they have very little confidence when they come together as collectives. In fact, they kind of become mutually suspicious, or they kind of worry, or there's just something about the kind of community when it comes together that it needs something else to be directed.
Do you think that's because of the failure of the state over the last 30 years?
I think the failure of the state is actually the result of that. So I think, because I kind of think about longer historical patterns, so not just the last 30 years. I mean, to me, the fact that the Albanians were the last to get out of the Ottoman Empire is a good example of, they need an authority. As I say, individually, they're very confident. They don't need authority. And it's because they're so confident individually that when they're then kind of collectively together, because it's so hard to somehow run themselves, then you have the emergence of a power. It's a leader, so you have a kind of authoritarian pattern that comes out of this extreme confidence in the individual, but which doesn't develop into something more productive collectively. So I think, and that pattern, I see that still in place in the country. I don't really see a lot of discussion around, look, we can control our society, we can be democratic citizens, we can hold our politicians to account. I mean, everybody complains all the time, but I don't really see, it's not a very forward-looking narrative. It's always a kind of blame game. And that happens also at the individual level. So the blaming game then prevails over the taking of joint responsibility and saying, okay, now let's just look to the future and let's think about how we can all mobilize and how we can all regenerate our democracy. And as I say, on that front, I'm not too optimistic, and I don't really know what it will take to change other than soul searching and trying to understand, who we are and what kind of identity we have and why we are what we are.
And probably stronger institutions, which it's kind of a chicken and the egg situation.
Yeah, which goes back to my previous answer, right? Which is you also need the institutions, but the institutions that we have now, I don't think are equipped to do that, because they are institutions that leave to the privates do a lot of the work and are not sufficiently empowering of the public sphere, of the public realm.
Lea, returning to another salient character in the book and also to the discussion about individualizing responsibility, the story of Elona, your friend in the book, who was trafficked as a sex worker in Italy, is emblematic of the fate of many others who, like her, were the victims of the transition that were either lost at sea or lost their ability to survive under the new liberal free market economy. Failure was internalized, and loss and tragedy remain anonymous. About this, you write in your book, I accepted the anonymity of all the tragedies unfolding before me. And then later you write, referring to the factors that led to the civil war in 1997 in Albania. I accepted it, as we all did, as we accepted the liberal roadmap we had followed like a religious calling. Lea, the Albanian people fully accepted that following this liberal roadmap would lead to the establishment of our own civil society and eventually our successful integration into the European economic and political system, which did not come to fruition as expected. Why do you think we Albanians internalized the blame and also accepted the narrative of the liberal roadmap? Was there an alternative? Have we learned any lessons today from the history as Albania works toward accession to the European Union?
I'll start with the last one. I'm not convinced that we have. I think the way I see the discussions around integration in the European Union play in Albania, and when I see the kind of enthusiasm that I find, you have a degree of belief that this set of institutions will be like the Messiah, and that they will save the Albanian people, which I think speaks to this discussion that we were just having with the previous question, which is speaks to the need for a savior. It's almost as though you don't believe that you yourself can do it and somebody else needs to come and help you and save you. And again, it's one of the paradoxes is that on the one hand, this is a very nationalistic country, so one that's very proud and very convinced of its strength and of its traditions and so on. And on the other hand, somehow needs someone else. So the discourse is either it's the international community in Albania or it's the European Union. And now it's this great hope that once we integrate in the European Union, things will be resolved. And I very much doubt it, both if you see the pattern of other societies, other states that have joined the EU, that this wasn't the end of their troubles. Also because you look at the kind of EU advanced countries themselves, the kind of more advanced economies, they themselves are in trouble. And so there's questions of unequal development and injustice there as well. So it's not at all obvious that things from the European side look much rosier, but somehow Albanians aren't really having these conversations around, what can we bring to the EU rather than what can we take from the EU? What's the EU going to help us with? How are we going to contribute to this integration discourse? So I don't really see that. I don't know that we could have done, as I say, anything different in terms of the roadmap and the shock therapy and so on, because this was a pattern that was present throughout Eastern Europe and the Balkans. And this clearly, there was aspects of it that were clearly top down. So the chapter in the book in which I talk about my father's struggle as a director of the port, where we really tried to convince these people from these international experts that he thought that there was a cost to this and the human cost was too high and so on. I think this was clearly, from that perspective, I remember from his perspective, really difficult to change. There was a structure there that was imposing choices on individuals, and individuals didn't really have much to do other than, comply, because otherwise they were left with very little. Why did we internalize the blame? Because because we were not thinking a bit like everyone else actually around in the world at the end of the Cold War. Well, we stopped thinking systemic thoughts. So we stopped thinking about the system. We thought about the system when we were under communism, and that didn't work. And so again, we kind of endorse the Fukuyama thesis that when you don't have systemic thinking, when you don't have a system to blame, when you don't have relations that are conducive to institutions and historical patterns, then who do you blame? Well, it's always about individuals not performing, or individuals being lazy, or not finding the right opportunities, or bad luck happening to them. So we internalized the blame because there was no alternative narrative for us to fit these failures into. They were always individual tragedies and catastrophes that somehow we had to accept, like the way we accepted the weather. And I think, again, this is where we still are in a way. When I go back to Albania, I don't really see many people asking themselves the question of, does it have to be this way? It's always about one person that is being bad, or one person having bad luck, but it's never about questioning the general framework.
Speaking of your father, well, first in the book, you explain that your mother does not believe in the power of the state, only on individualism. She says that one should do the most to rely on the state as little as possible. Alternatively, your father, like many in his generation, assumed that, and quote, freedom was lost when other people tell us how to think, what to do, where to go. Socialism to him clearly denied freedom, but it quickly became evident that capitalism did so as well. You write that, quote, he did not want the world to remain a place where solidarity is destroyed, where only the fittest survive, and where the price of achievement for some is the destruction of hope in others. In addition, your mother believes that people are naturally evil and should not be trusted, while your father believes in the common good and solidarity, as was shown by how you described his handling of the port situation. They both grew up and lived in the same totalitarian system, but had very diverging views on human nature. How do you explain this divergence? Would you say that now you see the world and life through your father's point of view, or more through your mother's point of view?
Yeah, I think I'm probably more sympathetic to my father, but because it comes down, I think, to how you think about human nature. And so it comes down to this question, where does this difference come from in how we think about human nature? And I don't really know. I mean, I'm pretty confident that there is a basic difference there between people who think of humans as possibly good and people who think of humans as inherently bad and evil and always potentially selfish. And I think I am on the optimistic side because I think, well, not because I think there's any evidence to be optimistic, but because it seems to me that the opposite is worse. So what do you gain? If you think about the future, what do you gain by always making assumptions that people are going to be evil? How can you build trust? How can you think about alternatives if you actually always thinking about this sort of human nature as this kind of evil? So it's, in a way, it's like, if you had to gamble on which side is right, well, it seems to me there's no evidence either way. But you want to gamble with the positive side because that will motivate you to act in a certain way that the other one wouldn't. So I think I'm inherently more sympathetic, but it's a very difficult question and very hard one. And I don't know that I have a good answer to where it comes from. I think it probably is just one of these kind of basic intuitions. There might be some evolutionary story to tell about either or both of them. The fact that we both have, from an evolutionary perspective, always needed community. But then on the other hand, there's also clearly a sense of survival and need to kind of fight for survival. So both of these tendencies are somehow present within the human. And so for me, the question, as I say, is like, what do you do with it? What do you do with this knowledge? How do you think about the future? And there, I think, yeah, I agree more with my father.
That striking that balance seems hard, and cultivating that side of human nature that would allow us to move toward a more just society where freedom can be realized would be, I think, the goal. Lea, currently in Albania, as well as various Western democracies, including the US and the UK, there is a rising tide of nihilism, skepticism, disillusionment, and division. What is, in your opinion, the antidote to this corrosive phenomena, and how should we reimagine the concept of freedom and invigorate democratic values and continue the struggle, as you put it in your book?
Well, I mean, I think on this part, I'm a materialist. So I think if you change the system, if you change the kind of economic incentives, and if you change political institutions, then you will also change the psychological incentives. So if you build institutions that enable people to cooperate rather than fight each other, then hopefully they will find potential and they will find positives in the life that they have. And if we have societies that are alienating and controlling and exploitative, then it's obvious to see where skepticism and where disillusionment comes from. And so when I see the tendencies towards nihilism, which then I think politically turns often into conservative or far-right attitudes, because it's the easiest type of instinct to manipulate and to mobilize from certain politicians, I think it's very hard to occupy the moral high ground and say, well, these people are stupid, or they're kind of wrong, or there's, this, why don't they think better? Why don't they think positive? I don't think it's a question of will and changing the will. I think it's a question of changing perhaps the political framework through which they operate and through which that will is shaped. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this has come after 40 years of neoliberalism and 40 years of struggles and dispossession of the commons and kind of rising privatization and inequality. So I have a kind of economic analysis there that helps me explain a global kind of diagnosis that helps me explain why there are these tendencies, and which I think it's very hard to change, as I say, if you don't interfere at that level.
Lea, we do have some very interesting questions from our audience. Unfortunately, we cannot get to all of them, ladies and gentlemen, but thank you for submitting them. I do have a couple that I think are relevant and fall into the conversation nicely. One of them is, all anonymous, of course, is freedom, however defined, an end in and of itself or a means to an end? And if the latter, what is the end?
Mm-hmm. I don't think it's a means to an end. I think of freedom as a kind of intrinsic value, but I also don't think that it's a kind of it's an end, because I think it's always there with us. So there is a difference between the moral freedom that we started with and the social and political freedom. I think the moral freedom is always there, but the concept of moral freedom that we started with by itself is not enough, because it's not enough for all of us individually to feel this kind of moral freedom. What we want is also, as we were just saying now, to have political institutions that make that moral freedom easier to be realized in the external world. And not just that, but also makes it easier for us to kind of leave good institutions to the next generations. And so that means from this inherent internal moral conception of freedom, there is a kind of political conception of freedom that becomes also a kind of goal. And so then the goal, I guess the overarching goal, I would say, is a world of free relations. And so it's one where you don't just have moral freedom, but where you also have freedom politically and institutionally realized.
And you did touch on this on one of your previous answers a little bit, but one of our audience members asked, what do you see as some other barriers to the development of rule of law in Albania?
Well, I think one of the barriers is actually the exclusive focus on just the rule of law. So I think it's important to expand the discourse and to talk and to see how we talk about the law. So I don't really see that the conversations that we're having, and this is again talking about kind of developmental models and thinking about what we're trying to build in Albania and so on, we rely too much on the rule of law, but we don't really define what a good law is. So the rule of law by itself is a very abstract denomination. The rule of law means that the law rules, but that doesn't tell us what the law looks like. You need to have good laws to believe in the rule of laws. And what good laws are requires a kind of larger discussion around politics and around society of the sort that we've just started. So I think, so I'm kind of, as I say, from a wider discursive perspective, I'm a little bit skeptical, because I worry that in Albania, we talk too much about the rule of law without saying what we mean by it and how, what makes a good law. We don't have enough conversation about that. And we also don't have enough conversation on how we can involve citizens in coming up with answers, because I don't think any one of us actually has a definitive solution to the problem of what makes a good law. I think that's what democracy is about, and that's why you need a process in place. But we're not really having these conversations around how to have that process and how to involve people. And so that to me is a limit.
What was your motivation to study, write about, and teach Marxism now as a professor? And have you ever considered politics as a professional endeavor?
Thank you. So I start with the last one. I think we are all political in our lives, insofar as we care about politics and we care about, democracy and all the things that we've been talking about, insofar as we have conversations like this one. I haven't really thought about joining professional politics or career politics, because I don't think that all the work in society is done by professional politicians. I'm also very worried that actually once you become a professional politician, you realize that the work is much more constrained than you initially thought. So I'm kind of hypersensitive to the limitations of politics and to the possibility of kind of being disillusioned. You think you go into politics by, you think you're going to change things if you join politics, and then you discover that there's an entire structure there that makes it very difficult for you. So I don't think I'm a better person or would be a better politician than the hundreds of other politicians that kind of join politics and discover that that is very hard. And I actually believe that sometimes having certain conversations and having discourses in society, and each of us having a division of labor where each of us does their work in the sphere that they have chosen, is just as plausible and to me just as valid politically than being a career politician. So to me, there's a distinction between, as I say, being interested in politics and being a political agent and a political citizen, and being an elected politician, which is just a very small fraction of what actually political life is. Yeah, I think I might have left half of the question, but I didn't make a note. So
it was fine. It was the question was about your motivation to
yes,
pursue
how did
a
I
career
get into
as an
Marx?
academic.
Yeah, so I got into it. I actually didn't want to get into it at all. I went to study in Italy, and at the point in which I went to study in Italy, I was really like very typical Eastern European child who comes from real communist experience, and actually hates anything that's kind of communism, smacks of communism, and hates like these leftist Western people who do all this kind of leftist stuff without much awareness of what's been going on in Eastern Europe, and also without much sensitivity to the historical patterns and so on. So I was like avoiding it for a very long time at university, and I had a political philosophy course where I every year the prof was teaching Marx, and I was like, no, I'm not going to do Marx. I don't want to know about Marx. I'm just kind of stay away from it, until one year in which he did liberalism. But of course, this was a left-wing professor, so he did liberalism in a way that was critical. And somehow, despite my skepticism around the socialist tradition, which came from just me being from Albania, I found a lot of the criticisms of the liberal tradition not just very plausible in theory, but also really resonating with this experience that we've just been discussing of post-90 Albania. And so the arguments and the texts and the discussion around the text then made me think that maybe there was more to that tradition than we had given it credit for while being in Albania. And so then I began to go back and forth between these two traditions, between kind of liberalism and socialism, and trying to find common points and where they differed, and became very interested in the history of them. And so then it became more of an intellectual journey. And I think what then really ultimately drew me to Marx was that I had this love-hate relationship to it. On the one hand, I was very interested because I found the criticism plausible. On the other hand, I hated the fact that I was interested, and also that my parents were so annoyed that I was interested. And so it became a kind of very personal thing, which I think really, I say in the epilogue that I wrote the book to try and settle this controversy in myself, and it really was like that and felt like that until I actually came to write the book.
How did this is one of my thoughts. How did, as a child, you have the wherewithal to write down and create a memoir so intricate and so intelligent and so thoughtful and compassionate and analytical at the same time? Did you, sounds silly to even ask, back as a child think you were going to write a book about this whole experience?
No, never thought about I write a book about this. I always wanted to write books, and was interested in writing, and was always interested in literature. And I think was always interested. I chose to study philosophy because I was interested in literature. And one of the reasons I was interested in literature was that I was interested in exploring from the microscopic perspective how big ideas and how histories and how larger patterns appear in individual lives. And there is a kind of sensitivity to literature which you lose when you then move, as I did, to philosophy, because you then become only interested in structures and discussions and ideas, and somehow you lose sight of the emotions and of people. So and so then when I decided to write this book for a general audience, I decided to kind of go back to my initial interest in literature and write it in this more literary perspective, because I thought that this book deserved the recovery of exactly that. That I felt that the ordinary people of Albania had never really been given a voice, or never been given many voices in a book like this, that they all needed. Everyone I knew in Albania had a story to tell. And what this book does is it tries to take all these different stories and put them all in one book and just give people voice. In part also because I think another aspect of this is that Albania is not a country that you look at from the outside and where people think it has a voice or that has many voices. So it's a country where people assume, oh, well, this was just a totalitarian society. It was a communist country, so people were oppressed. So what did they know about, the world? And I wanted to show that actually Albanians knew a lot more about the world than the world knew about Albania. And I wanted to kind of convey that complexity through the different characters of the book, but it could only be done by writing the book in this more literary way. Otherwise, I would have ended up like Fukuyama, who says, what does Albania know about ideas? So.
Okay, and you did talk about your next book. Will this be a sequel?
The next book, no, will be a prequel. So I'm writing about my grandmother and about her life, but what I'm really interested in is to explain how communism arrived in Albania and why it arrived in the form in which it arrived historically. And so I want to look at these initial years of nation building and state building, 1920s and 30s, and the conflict between liberals, fascists, socialists, communists, and through that life of my grandmother, explore some of these kind of ideological and historical conflicts and try and write another family history of the kind that I've done with Free, but just moving to a different time period and trying to give more of a kind of diagnosis of what happened.
Excellent. We'll look forward
One
to
quick
it.
question, Lea.
Go ahead.
Because you mentioned, it's interesting to me how the child in the book, you as a child, were so pro Enver communism to the point where you were angry at your parents for not being as pro-communism as you were as a child. And then you mentioned that you got to Italy and you're very anti-Marxist ideas. That's a very short period of time from early 90s to a couple of years later. When did that change happen where you weren't quite, as gung-ho about Enver idealism and then became very anti, any leftist policies?
Yeah, I think it happened very quickly after the system change, actually, as it happened for all of us. I think 92, 93, when I was told all the history of my family and how much they had suffered and from my grandmother all through her stories and stuff, I became like really resentful. And so I think that was the point where then I was from then on just thinking about liberalism, and I felt like, yeah, that's where it happened very quickly after the fall of the wall of the fall of the system. And then when did the conversion happen? The kind of the reconversion, the kind of dialectical turn back to the criticism. I think that was a lot longer, and I don't know that it's complete, because in a way that is to me what I now think about socialism and about that kind of tradition of criticism of liberalism is much more open-ended, and in some ways much more of a kind of utopian horizon than just going back and recovering the text and recovering the authors, or despite what some of my fellow Albanians say, there's no kind of element of nostalgia or like of kind of desire to replicate any of these patterns. In fact, it's the opposite. It's the effort to try and take it very, very seriously, that tragic history, when thinking about alternatives to the system. And so that's kind of much more open-ended. But it did help me that I was in Italy with leftists who were, and kind of progressives, like the people who shaped me intellectually, who were, as I say, on the left, but on this Italian Gramscian left. It helped me because they had been also kind of left that the communists in Albania had fought. So I remember when I went to Enver Hoxha's house a couple of years ago in Drilon, he has his library there, and there's a book called Eurocommunism is Anti-Communism. And so I think, there is a tradition of left-wing progressive thinking that is just as much at odds with state and various kind of communist Albanian theory than as it is with other stuff. So that was kind of the recovery.
Well, thank you, Lea. Okay,
you
Chris, you go.
Yeah, this idea that there's criticism of the book, in particular in Albania, and kind of you're not quite denouncing communism as strongly as one might in a book like this. What's your reaction to that, your response to that?
I mean, there's several responses. Look, one is that they could be right. I could be just writing from the point of view of a political prisoner, but other people have done that, and that perspective is already there, and the public is already familiar with it. So I'm trying to convey a variety of viewpoints on it, and I tried in my book to have many voices and to kind of give all the different layers of reality under communism, including, the bubblegum, including the childhood socialization aspect, including what you were taught in school, including how you absorbed what you were taught in school, including the way in which ideology works and kind of creates people, including how complicity works and this kind of network of complicity on the one hand, but also resistance on the other. These different perspectives would be very difficult to convey if you only had that one viewpoint of, the dissident. So I don't say that that's not a valid perspective. It's just that, as I say, I wanted to give a sense also to the outside readers of Albania and actually, as I say, the story resonates outside Albania as well with sort of former communist countries. But I wanted to very strongly signal, look, there are thinking people here, and there is a society that has a lot of stuff in it that you might not be aware of because you've only read it through this lens of like, it's communist and this is how we understand communism. And just I felt that I wanted to do something different with the book. But the book isn't representative of everyone. It's only representative of those who wanted to represent it in this way. And so I understand the criticism, and I don't want to say that, you know, they're wrong or they read the book wrongly or whatever. I think it's a valid perspective.
Okay, thank you, Lea. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our webinar. The Albanian-American Bar Association thanks Professor Lea Ypi, and thanks you, members of the audience, for joining us tonight. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Lea.
Thank you so much, Lea. This was a great discussion. Thank you for making the time for us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. And I hope I'll see you at some point when I'm in Boston for real.
Make it happen. Make it happen. We'll welcome you.
Will do. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.